Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everyone. I'm, of course, your host, Daniel Rhodes, and my guest today is Dr. Ann Pyburn. Ann, thanks so much for being here.
Lovely to meet you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was pretty much raised in the field by a field biologist who was doing research on frogs in Central America and then later in South America and Colombia. So field work pretty much came naturally to me. But my mom was interested in archaeology. So you catch frogs at night, but she took me to archaeological sites in the daytime. So I grew up from the time I was 9 wanting to be an archaeologist. But I think that archaeology turned out to be quite different from what I anticipated. And then I spent my career trying to make it even more different from what I anticipated. But I've done field work in a lot of places. Right now, for the past many years, I've been provost professor of anthropology at Indiana University. But I've done field work in a lot of different places in West Africa, in Yemen. These were both cultural anthropology projects. But I've also done archaeology in the US Southwest, in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. I've done archaeology in Peru. I'm trained as a Mayanist. So I went to Reed College as an undergraduate and Arizona for my master's and my PhD, where I trained to study Maya culture. But more recently, I've become interested in Central Asia, and I've done some research in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. But the course of my career, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself in this way, because I know we're going to talk about Indiana Jones. And I want to tell you a little bit more about myself because I don't want my comments, my critical comments, to be taken in as an indication that I'm not a real archaeologist, because I'm pretty real. Because my career has kind of spanned the revolution in archaeology, because archaeology has changed tremendously from when I was in graduate school. And I like to say it's turned out to be more important than we thought it was when I was in graduate school. It means more to people than we thought it meant. We thought it was just pure science, and that we archaeologists were producing esoteric knowledge that nobody cared about but us. At any rate, I earlier in my career, I found a lot of stuff. I found a city, a Maya city called Chowhish. I named it in collaboration with the village that actually showed me where it was, which is the way archaeologists usually find cities. National Geographic doesn't tell you that part. But I've opened tombs. I've excavated temples. I ran the excavations of 3 Maya cities in northern Belize. But from finding stuff, I went on to find out stuff. So I was interested in gender and origins of our ideas about gender in the present. So I wrote a book about that. And then I was interested in class differences. I was interested in why all Maya archaeology seemed to be about elite people. So I studied the remains of ordinary people, and I found some that people didn't know about. And then I was interested in the idea of collapse, because I don't believe there was a Maya collapse. That's another lecture I promise I won't give you today. But from there, because it's a colonial idea, the idea that other cultures collapse and disappear, I became interested in colonialism. So now I'm most interested in the way that archaeologists have misused the past and misconstructed the past and the repercussions of that for living people. So I've worked on community museums in Kyrgyzstan to help Kyrgyz people decide how they want their heritage to be presented to the world instead of waiting till UNESCO tells them what it is. And I've worked on land rights for Maya people. The Maya of Belize have won the right to indigenous land in their country, which is an important milestone in Maya heritage. And I teach now. I've taught Maya archaeology, I've taught ancient women, I've taught the archaeology of the Bronze Age in Central Asia, but now I mostly teach research ethics. and activism, archaeology and activism. So that's me.
Well, I think ethics is a good segue into what we're actually going to talk about today, and that is Indiana Jones. This is something that, you know, when you tell people you're an archaeologist or you're studying archaeology, this is the forefront in their mind, that you're putting on a leather fedora and running through the jungles while people shoot at you. While that is true in some parts of the world, the majority of what Indiana Jones is portrayed as is, remember, it's fiction, folks.
Yes. It's been some years ago, but there was an archaeologist, well, he's still alive, I believe, named Peter Matthews, who was involved in what he described as a very Indiana Jones experience. He was involved in working with the government of a Latin American country to move an altar, a Maya monument, from its location in the jungle, in the forest, to an urban museum in order to protect it. Local people were helping retrieve the monument and put it in a truck to be taken away. And in the course of this activity, another group of Maya people came with guns and stopped them from moving the monument, and took their shoes away. Matthews and his crew swam across the river, but the local people who were helping them were kind of stuck, left behind. I don't know that anybody was seriously hurt. But ostensibly, Matthews was working with the government and with the local community to preserve the monument. But it turned out that the monument, the people whose ancestors had made the monument, were actually the people who stopped him from moving it. And the local people who had been helping him had been moved into that place by the government to undermine the land rights of the people who were actually indigenous to the area. So moving their heritage monument from that location into a museum did not make them happy. So I think one of the problems with Indiana Jones movies is the idea that artifacts themselves have some kind of agency, that it doesn't really matter where the artifact comes from, if it's the Ark of the Covenant or if it's the Antikythera mechanism, which is actually a real thing. It doesn't do what apparently Indiana Jones claims it does, but it was kind of an ancient computer. The idea that those things of themselves are magical and therefore don't belong to any particular cultural heritage or cultural group or descended community. And that's a kind of an old-fashioned idea that most archaeologists have moved beyond at this point. I think most people think that Indiana Jones is disliked by archaeologists because he's not a good scientist. I think he's disliked because he gives people the idea that archaeology is about finding stuff and owning stuff and selling stuff, when we hope that it's about finding out stuff. The idea that the preservation of artifacts is all important to us is not really science. What interests most descendant communities and more archaeologists is the preservation of culture.
Yeah, and that's, you know, something that when you watch the Indiana Jones films, he doesn't really take a lot of interest in, is who the people are that it actually belongs to, or whoever made the artifact that he's looking for, whether it's the Ark of the Covenant, the chalice of Jesus, or, you know, the Shankara stones. He doesn't really care about the people who made it. He cares more about the thing itself. And while that is important in archaeology, that's just a tiny, tiny fragment of what makes something interesting or important.
Yeah, archaeologists all know that it's the context of the object that gives it meaning. So if you take an artifact from its context, from its heritage context, and you put it in a museum, it has a different meaning. So a heritage object that's in its original location at a Maya archaeological site means one thing. It means something else when it's on display in the Metropolitan Museum. And what it means, I think, to most people who visit the Metropolitan Museum and see Maya heritage monuments is that the culture has died, the culture has collapsed, it has disappeared, that the descended community cannot take care of their heritage. In fact, very few people outside of the Maya world know that there are between 8 and 10,000 Maya speakers alive today. And that's not what presenting objects of their cultural patrimony in a Western museum context conveys to people, that the culture is still vibrant and alive.
Yeah, and that's something that when people remove objects or they just in general transport the objects, is they don't understand that, they're actually changing how people perceive this artifact. Like, putting it in a museum, while the display is nice and everything, it's not. If it was a living thing, I would say it's natural habitat.
Well, I mean, objects adapt, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So they convey a different message, but unfortunately, that message is more about colonialism and capitalism. Indiana Jones has been the movie has been criticized, and I haven't seen the new one, but I've read some reviews, and one of the criticisms is that that Harrison Ford is too old to be an action hero. Now that's ageism. Since I'm almost 70, I'm not in favor of ageism, but I would say that the colonial message that is the foundation of these movies, that is dated, that is out of date. That's, I believe, what makes the movies tired, is that people have become much more sophisticated in their understanding of cultural heritage and cultural property, and the idea that white people from wealthy nations have the right to go into countries that are economically challenged and take stuff so that they could protect it. That's an idea that has come and gone. I hope.
Yeah, it's like a looter mentality. The only thing you care about is the stuff that you can actually take with you when you leave.
Yeah. Well, and it's coming home to roost in many cases. If you read the New York Times today, Shelby White, a very famous collector who's very prominent in the Archaeological Institute of America and who has funded a lot of good archaeological research and endowed the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, is having her home raided for artifacts that she ostensibly brought from reputable collectors, but that were actually stolen. And so the idea that preserving the stuff is our priority it's been hard to get past, but I believe we are getting past it. Alison Wiley, she's a philosopher of science of archaeology, and she was one of the people who wrote the Society for American Archaeology's Code of Ethics back in the 90s. She said that the first principle of ethics was preservation, because the committee thought that if different communities couldn't agree about what was important, they could at least agree that it should be preserved. The problem turned out to be that definitions of preservation are not all the same as Shelby White's.
Yeah, that's something that, when you talk to different people in the field, everyone has a different definition of what they think archaeology is or what they think preservation is. when, they're always use the same two or three key words like protection, recovery, things like that, but it's still the same practice.
Yeah, in Australia, Indigenous Australians, by Australian law, have the right to paint over 30,000-year-old rock art, because for their culture, for their heritage to be preserved, it has to be in use. They have to be able to use it. And that's what makes it preserved. That archaeologists cringe when they hear that, but it's not up to archaeologists to decide how Indigenous people preserve their heritage. Many of the cachitas and artifacts that are the heritage of Indigenous people on Turtle Island, which is the U.S., were intended to deteriorate, that the deterioration is part of their job in the world. So covering them with arsenic, which is what museums used to do, and putting them in cold storage is kind of anathema to their function, and it's not preserving them in the right way.
Well, that's something that we tell people. It's a basic lesson of archaeology. It is a destructive practice, but at the same time, the word destructive is a relative term.
Yeah, if what we're trying to understand is the relationship between material culture and culture, then the archaeological record is renewed every time you drop a pencil.
Yeah, I have friends who every time we go out in the field, they drop a pencil or one of their headphones or something. Somebody's going to be excavating an 18th century well in like a decade or so and find a headphone in it. I'm like, well, that's technically an artifact.
Yes. Yes, when I was doing my dissertation at Nochmul in northern Belize, we were looking at trenches dug by a 19th century doctor named Thomas Gann, who looted a lot of archaeological sites in Belize, and we found his shirt buttons and evidence of his actions, his activity areas.
Yeah, we found a piece of a vinyl record, and we're widely speculating who it actually belonged to. We were saying it's probably an original Bob Dylan. And it turns out it's from like the 1920s, and we're still saying it's the original Bob Dylan.
He's pretty old, but not quite that old.
It's the original Keith Richards album.
Oh, well, that's more convincing.
So back on Indiana Jones, what in your opinion, what does the series actually get right for archaeology's sake, if anything?
Oh, that's really hard. I have colleagues who think that it's a wonderful uh, uh, advertisement for archaeology, that it brings people to the field, it encourages people to take an interest in archaeology. But I'm afraid it encourages people to take an interest in looting, which is not what we do. And if it's attracting people who want to go into other countries and steal things, we're perhaps attracting the wrong audience. That are going to be quite disappointed when they have to learn to draw a Harris matrix.
Oh, I was going to say when they end up having to pay like a $40,000 fine for violating heritage management laws or something.
Go to jail, actually. I believe in the film before this one, and I really am not an Indiana Jones expert, even though I'm in Indiana. I believe Harrison Ford was supposedly recovering artifacts for the descendant community, that he was trying to get something back for them. I think the way he went about it was perhaps not very archaeological, but that would be closer to the kind of message that I hope people would get about what we do. I'm also, and I'm not going to give you a good answer to your question, because I'm particularly bothered by the idea that all of his adventures, the things that he does that are portrayed as so swashbuckling, he deals with corrupt officials and dangerous thieves and bugs and rain and snakes, and those are ordinary life for lots of people. And the only reason it's an adventure is because he's an entitled white guy. So claiming those the difficulties of coping with difficulties outside of the most privileged parts of the world as some kind of heroic adventure, is kind of creepy, right? Or I would just say perhaps colonial. I mean, yes, archaeologists do have adventures, indeed. I just worry about selling those as the purpose of what we do. Sorry.
No, I was just thinking the one thing that I actually agree with that Indiana Jones gets accurate is the bugs, the rains, and the snakes, because that sums up my experience in the field of archaeology.
It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I've been often thought neck deep in a 1x1 in the jungle, in the sun, in the tropics, with doctor flies trapped with me in the bottom of a 1x1. Doctor flies are the biting insects. Thought, why do I have a PhD? what good is a PhD if I'm going to dig holes in the mud?
Yeah, every now and then I'll be in a situation where I just sit and think back on my life that I was like, okay, what made me think this was a good idea?
And the more successful you
become, I like doing it. That's what made me think this was a good idea.
And then the more successful you become, the less you get to activate.
And then I'm like, oh, right. I love doing this. What's wrong with
paperwork?
Yeah, that's something I've never seen Indiana Jones do is paperwork.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I believe the ratio is usually said to be 2/3 lab work to 1/3 field work.
And I'm sitting there watching the Indiana Jones movie, and he does all this work usually on behalf of like a university or something. And I wonder if they reimburse him for all this travel he's doing.
Yeah, as somebody who has to deal with the university grants office, I wonder how he pays for those guns. I'm pretty sure that the National Science Foundation would not pay for a handgun. Maybe.
I mean, I don't know that they wouldn't. I mean, this is the United States. I don't see why they wouldn't pay for it here.
Maybe be an interesting research project.
Well, and it has been so great having you on the show. Any last minute advice you want to throw out to people who watch the episode?
There's a new Nova special on the archaeology of South America, starring an archaeologist named Eduardo Neves, and it is absolutely spectacularly wonderful. And I recommend it. I highly recommend it to anybody who's really interested in archaeology and really wants to know what archaeology is today, because the future of archaeology, I'm pretty sure, is about restitutive justice. It's about bringing justice to people whose heritage has been interfered with by colonialism and whose contemporary situation is affected by misunderstandings of their past. So watch Nova.
Hey, Nova is a great program, and I've been watching it as far back as I can remember. And most of the time, it's actually really good.
this particular episode is outstandingly good. It's brand new and it's really special, and it's about the kind of community archaeology that you're talking about, working with descendant indigenous groups in South America, and understanding the history and the heritage of the people who have been missing from our understanding of the past. So yes, watch Nova. And one more recommendation. There's a new book by David Graeber and David Wengrow called The Dawn of Everything, and you should read it.
Well, again, Anne, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed having you on the show.
Lovely to meet you.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.